Welcome to QHSE Talks. In today's episode, we are taking a deep dive into environmental management, a subject that has moved from being a supporting function to becoming a central pillar of professional safety practice. The modern safety leader is no longer confined to injury prevention metrics and OSHA compliance checklists. The scope now includes environmental protection, regulatory strategy, sustainability awareness, and integrated risk governance. For those preparing for the ASP or CSP exams, this is not optional knowledge. It is blueprint-driven competency. Environmental management aligns directly with CSP Blueprint 11, primarily within Domain 7, Environmental Management Systems. It also reinforces Domain 2 through regulatory frameworks and management systems, and Domain 4 through spill response and emergency preparedness. In other words, this topic strengthens both your exam performance and your real-world authority as a risk professional. Environmental regulations can appear overwhelming, a landscape of acronyms, statutory language, and layered compliance requirements. Yet, when broken down properly, they reveal a structured system designed to control liability, prevent environmental harm, and protect public health. Understanding that system shifts you from reactive compliance to strategic leadership. This shift is not abstract. It is visible in how organizations define responsibility, how leadership roles are structured, and how performance is measured across industries. When you look at job descriptions today, when you analyze what employers expect from a safety leader, you can see the shift clearly.
That is becoming the standard. I mean, just look at job titles today. It is rarely just safety manager.
No, it's EHS.
It's EHS, Manager Environmental Health and Safety. The E is right there in the title, and you just cannot ignore it. And honestly, even if your title is just safety, if you don't understand the environmental side, you are leaving your organization open to just massive liability.
So to help us navigate this, we are pulling from a really comprehensive source today. We are looking at the Safety Professionals Reference and Study Guide, the 4th edition, written by W. David Yates.
A fantastic resource.
It is, and specifically, thanks to the team at QHSE Talks, we are going to be doing an extremely deep dive into Chapter 34, which is titled, appropriately, Environmental Management.
And this chapter is a goldmine. It really is. It is essentially a roadmap through what we often call the alphabet soup of federal regulations.
This is the alphabet soup.
Yeah, we were talking our CRA, FIFRA, CAA, ANEQ-QS, all those acronyms that make people's eyes glaze over.
They do.
But our mission today is to demystify them. We want to understand not just what the letters stand for, but why a safety professional, and especially those of you preparing for your ASP or CSP exams, must master this material.
That is the goal. We are going to try to make regulatory text interesting today.
That is a bold promise. I like it.
We'll see how we do.
But I think we can do it, because when you connect the dots between these regulations and actual, real-world workplace liability, it stops being dry text and it starts being a survival guide.
A survival guide. I like that.
It's about keeping your plant open and keeping yourself out of handcuffs.
Okay, let's unpack this. This marriage between safety and the environment. Yates, in the very beginning of this chapter, makes an argument that these disciplines have as much in common as they differ. He sort of plays marriage counselor here.
He does, and he is absolutely right. I mean, if you think about it, both disciplines are rooted in the same fundamental concept: hazard recognition and control.
Okay.
In safety, you are controlling a hazard so it doesn't hurt a worker. You identify the risk, you evaluate the severity, and you implement controls: elimination, substitution, engineering, admin, PPE.
Right, the hierarchy of controls. We know it well.
Exactly. We live and breathe it. Now, just apply that same logic to environmental management. You identify a hazard, say, a toxic solvent or a particulate emission.
Okay.
You evaluate the risk. Will it leak into the groundwater? Will it cause smog? And you implement controls: secondary containment, double wall tanks, scrubbers on the stacks. The process is identical.
It's just the target that changes, or I guess the receptor.
Precisely. And a lot of times, the target is closer than you think.
Yeah.
There is this old saying in the industry, you've probably heard it: safety is about protecting the worker inside the fence.
And environment is about protecting the community outside the fence.
Right. But think about a chemical spill. Does the chemical know where the fence line is?
No, the chemical definitely does not check the property map before it starts spreading.
Exactly. A release of a toxic gas like chlorine or ammonia is an immediate safety hazard to the workers in the plant. That's an IDLH, an immediately dangerous to life or health situation.
For sure. Evacuate now.
But 5 minutes later, it's an environmental hazard to the neighborhood downwind. You can't separate them. And that is why the safety professional is so often the default owner of these programs.
It's just efficiency.
It is. It's about efficiency. You already know the chemicals. You already know the processes. It just makes sense for you to manage the environmental compliance too.
Now, to really understand where we are today, we have to look back a bit. And Yates in the book highlights a very specific year as a turning point for U.S. environmental policy. And that year is 1970.
1970 is the watershed moment.
Right.
Now, it is important to clarify, and Yates makes this distinction, that conservation didn't start in 1970.
Right.
The conservation movement goes back 100 years prior to that.
Yeah.
You know, we had national parks, we had Teddy Roosevelt, we had people who cared about the land. But that was largely about preservation, keeping the nice places nice.
It wasn't necessarily about telling a factory what they could or couldn't put in a pipe.
Exactly. Before 1970, pollution control was largely just a patchwork of state laws or common law nuisance suits.
So you had to sue them yourself.
Yeah. If a factory polluted your river, you had to sue them personally. You had to prove that their specific sludge ruined your specific property. It was expensive, it was hard to prove, and it was very, very inconsistent.
It was the Wild West.
It really was. But by the late 60s, the optics were just bad. You had the Cuyahoga River in Ohio literally catching fire because it was so polluted.
I've seen the pictures. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. You had smog in major cities so thick you couldn't see down the block. The public demand shifted. And in 1970, we got the EPA. We got the structure for the Clean Air Act as we know it today. We got the framework that would eventually lead to the Occupational Safety and Health Act, effectively the same year.
So it was a massive shift, a shift from we should protect nature to you will protect nature or we will fine you and shut you down.
Correct. Command and control. We were living in the world the 1970 built. And for the safety pro, that means navigating the legacy of all those laws.
Okay, let's dive into the first big chunk of that legacy. We need to talk about waste. And specifically, a piece of legislation with a very catchy acronym, RCRA.
RCRA.
That stands for the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act of 1976.
RCRA. It is the beast of waste management. If you were in manufacturing, healthcare, even like retail, you deal with RCR.
I've heard RCRA described with a very specific and slightly terrifying analogy. I've heard it called the Hotel California of waste regulation.
That is an incredibly accurate analogy. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave.
Right. So explain that to me, because logically in normal business, if I sell a car to someone and they drive it away and crash it, it's their problem. I sold it. I'm done. So if I pay a waste hauler to come pick up my drums of hazardous waste and they drive away, it's their problem now, right?
Wrong. And that is the single most dangerous assumption a manager can make. RCRA operates on a principle called cradle to grave.
Cradle to grave. Okay, let's break that down.
So the cradle is the moment that waste is generated. The moment you use a solvent and it becomes spent, or the moment you decide a chemical is no longer usable. At that point, you are the generator. That is the birth of the waste. The grave is the final disposal or destruction of that waste. RCRA says that the generator, you, is responsible for that waste every single step of the way.
Even when it's on the truck.
Even when it's on the truck. Yeah. Even when it's at the treatment facility. Even when it's in the landfill.
Wait. Even after it's buried?
Forever. And this ties into liability concepts you find in Superfund laws. If you hire a cheap waste hauler and they take your drums and dump them in a swamp somewhere to save a buck,
right,
the EPA doesn't just go after the guy with the truck. They go to the swamp,
right,
they pull out the drums, they look at the manifest or the label, they see your company name, and they come back to you.
Oh, wow.
And I say, this is your waste. You are paying to clean up this swamp.
And saying, but I paid that guy to take it, is not a defense.
It is zero defense. You cannot outsource your liability. You own that liability forever.
That's terrifying. It really forces companies to be very, very careful about who they hire to haul their waste.
It is designed to be terrifying. It forces you to vet your vendors like your life depends on it. If you are a safety pro, you need to be auditing your TSDFs, your treatment, storage, and disposal facilities.
You actually have to go there.
You should. You need to know where that truck goes. You need to know if they are financially stable. because if they go bankrupt and leave a mess, the EPA comes back to the generators to pay the bill.
Wow. Okay, let's get into the weeds of RCRA a little bit. Yates points out an interesting structural detail. RCRA is a federal law passed by Congress. But if I'm a safety manager at a plant in, say, Ohio or Oregon, I'm probably not dealing with the EPA directly on a day-to-day basis.
That's right. And this is a crucial distinction called delegated authority.
Delegated authority.
While RCRA is federal, the EPA has delegated the authority to implement the program to the states. Currently, I think it's 46 of the 50 states have this delegated authority.
So the feds set the floor, and the states can build the house on top of it.
That's a perfect way to put it. The EPA sets the minimum standards. A state cannot be less strict than the federal RCRA regulations.
But they can be more strict.
But they can be more strict, and they often are.
Can you give an example of that?
California is the classic example. They regulate all sorts of things as hazardous waste that the federal EPA doesn't. So for most companies, you are dealing with your state agencies, the Department of Natural Resources, the DNR, or the Department of Environmental Quality, the DEQ, or whatever it's called in your specific state.
Which means if you move jobs from Texas to California or Michigan to Florida, you can't just assume the waste rules are identical.
Never assume that. That's a huge mistake. You have to check the state-specific code. What was totally legal in one state might be a huge violation in another.
Okay. Now, RCRA covers everything from generation to transportation, treatment, storage, and disposal, but we need to distinguish between two big buckets here that Yates spends a lot of time on: solid waste and hazardous waste.
Yes. And this is where the vocabulary gets really tricky, and it's a classic exam question area.
I can imagine.
In RCRA terms, solid waste is the broad category. But it doesn't actually have to be solid.
Wait, solid waste doesn't have to be solid.
Nope. Solid waste is just the legal term for garbage or refuse or discarded material.
Yeah.
It can be liquid, it can be semi-solid, it can even be a contained gaseous material.
So if I have a tank of liquid sludge that I'm getting rid of under RCRA, that's defined as solid waste.
That is a solid waste, correct.
Okay, so solid waste is the big umbrella.
Right. Now, hazardous waste is a specific subset of solid waste. To be a hazardous waste, it first has to be a solid waste.
Got it.
Then it has to meet certain criteria. It's either on a specific list published by the EPA or it exhibits a specific characteristic.
The lists versus the characteristics. Let's break those down.
Okay, the EPA loves lists. There are 4 main ones that Yates mentions. The F list covers non-specific sources. Think common solvents like acetone or toluene used in degreasing operations.
Stuff that a lot of different industries would use.
Exactly. The K list covers specific sources like sludge from petroleum refining or wastewater from explosives manufacturing. Very industry specific.
Okay.
And then the P and U lists cover discarded commercial chemical products, pure unused chemicals.
So if my waste is on one of those lists, it's hazardous, period. End of story.
Period. It doesn't matter if you dilute it. It doesn't matter if you think it's safe. If it's on the list, it is hazardous waste. Full stop.
But what if it's not on a list? What if I invented some new chemical soup in my lab?
Then you have to test it for characteristics. There are 4 characteristics that can make a waste hazardous: ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, and toxicity.
Okay, let's run through them. Ignitability.
Is it flammable? Specifically, does it have a flash point below 140 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 60 degrees Celsius? If yes, it's hazardous. Think solvents, waste paint, gasoline.
Makes sense. Corrosivity.
Is it an acid or a base? Specifically, is the pH less than or equal to 2 or greater than or equal to 12.5?
So really strong acids or caustics.
Exactly. Think battery acid or strong caustic cleaners.
Got it. Reactivity.
Is it unstable? Does it explode if you heat it? Does it react violently with water? Does it generate toxic gases like cyanide or sulfide when it gets wet?
Nasty stuff.
Very nasty stuff.
And finally, toxicity.
This one is tricky. This relies on a lab test called the TCLP, the Toxicity Characteristic Leaching Procedure.
The TCLP.
Basically, they take your waste, they grind it up, and they simulate acid rain leaching through it in a landfill.
Yeah.
And they see if it releases harmful stuff like lead, mercury, arsenic, or benzene above a certain concentration.
So it's simulating a worst-case scenario in a landfill.
That's exactly what it is.
So if my new chemical soup isn't on a list, but it has a flash point of 100 degrees.
And it's hazardous waste.
It's hazardous.
It's a decode waste. D001 for ignitable. And you have to manage it with all the strict rules.
Let's talk about a category that I think confuses people because it seems like it should be hazardous, but we treat it a little bit differently, and that's universal waste.
Ah, universal waste. This is a really practical carve-out in the regulations. Think about things that every single business generates. Batteries, pesticides, mercury-containing equipment like old thermostats and lamps, specifically fluorescent tubes.
Right, things that every business generates, not just big chemical plants.
Exactly. I mean, even a bank generates dead fluorescent tubes. Even a shoe store has exit sign batteries. If we forced every bank and every retail store to manage those light bulbs as full-blown hazardous waste,
The system would collapse.
it would collapse. With all the manifesting, strict labeling, EPA ID numbers, 90-day storage limits, it would be impossible.
Or more likely, people would just throw them in the dumpster.
Which is what used to happen. And that puts mercury and lead in the municipal landfill, which is exactly what we don't want. So the EPA created the universal waste rule to streamline the process.
To make it easier to do the right thing.
Precisely. It relaxes the regulations. You can store them for a full year instead of just 90 days. The labeling is simpler. Just universal waste lamps. You don't need a hazardous waste manifest for transport. It encourages recycling.
Okay, so it's a way of saying, we know this stuff is bad, but we want to make it easy for you to handle it properly.
Right. But here is the catch, and safety pros really need to hear this. The exemption relies on the item being intact.
What do you mean?
If you take that fluorescent tube and you crush it, it is no longer universal waste.
What is it then?
It is fully regulated hazardous waste
Oh.
because you have released the mercury vapors. So if you have one of those bulb crusher drums in your maintenance shop, you need to be very, very careful. You might be treating hazardous waste without a permit if you aren't following very specific rules for that device.
That is a key distinction. Intact versus broken.
Huge distinction.
Now, digging through Chapter 34, I found a specific exemption that Yates highlights, which I thought was fascinating. It's about used oil and agriculture. This feels like one of those surprising facts we promise our listeners.
It is. Used oil is a huge waste stream. I mean, almost everyone generates it. Forklifts, fleet vehicles, compressors.
Yeah.
But the regulations have a specific soft spot for farmers.
Okay, so what's the rule?
If you are an agricultural producer and you generate an average of 25 gallons or less per month of used oil, you are exempt from a lot of the stringent used oil management standards.
25 gallons a month? That's a fair amount for a small farm operation.
It is. It's roughly half a 55-gallon drum. It acknowledges the reality of rural operations, but, and there's always a but with the EPA.
Always a but.
If you exceed that 25 gallons, or if you aren't a farmer, so you run a mechanic shop or a factory, you have to follow the full rules. You need tanks that meet specific technical requirements. You need to use registered transporters who have EPA ID numbers.
You can't just give it to Bob with a truck to take it away.
You absolutely cannot. And there is a specific ban mentioned in the text regarding how you store this oil.
Right, the unlined surface impoundments.
Yes, which is a fancy way of saying a pit in the ground.
Exactly.
Back in the day, people would just dig a hole in the back pasture and dump their used oil in it, out of sight, out of mind. The soil would just soak it up. RCRA banned that explicitly. You cannot use the earth as your container. It has to be in a proper tank or a container. The pit days are over.
Because that oil goes straight down into the water table.
And then into your neighbor's well.
Speaking of things going into the ground, let's move the conversation to what lies beneath the facility. The hazard we can't see, underground storage tanks, or USTs.
This is subtitle High A of RCRA. And for a safety professional, this is a hidden nightmare. You can walk onto a site, you see a flat concrete pad, maybe a little vent pipe sticking up out of the ground. You might not realize there are 10,000 gallons of fuel sitting right under your feet.
What defines a UST? Because I assume if I have a septic tank in my backyard, that's not what we're talking about here.
No, the regulation, which is 40 CFR Part 280, defines a UST system as a tank and any underground piping connected to it that contains petroleum or certain hazardous substances. But here is the nuance that catches people, the 10% rule.
The 10% rule. Okay, break that down for me.
A tank system is considered a UST if at least 10% of its combined volume is underground, and that includes the piping.
Wait, hang on. Combined volume. So you're telling me if I have a big tank sitting above ground on a concrete pad, but it has a massive network of pipes buried underground feeding the factory?
Theoretically, yes. If the volume of all that buried piping adds up to 10% of the total system volume, that entire system can be regulated as a UST.
That would trip a lot of people up.
It does. They look at the tank and say, it's above ground, I'm exempt. But they completely forget about all the pipes.
And why are we so worried about USTs? Why is the EPA so obsessed with them?
Leaks. Simple as that. Groundwater contamination. In the past, tanks were just made of bare steel. And over time, what does steel do when you bury it in wet soil?
It rusts.
It rusts. Corrosion punches holes in the tank. And for years, we didn't know they were leaking until the gas station down the street had fuel coming out of their tap water.
Yates mentions a very specific deadline in the text, December 1998.
That was the line in the sand.
Yeah.
The EPA set these very stringent standards for design, release detection, spill protection, and oversoil prevention. And all the existing tanks had until December 2010, 1998, to upgrade to these modern standards, things like double walls, cathodic protection, or be permanently closed.
So that was over 25 years ago. Why does that specific date still matter so much to a safety pro today?
It matters because of legacy liability.
Yeah.
If you are a safety pro and you are doing an audit of a facility your company just bought, or you are inspecting an older site and you find a tank that looks old, maybe it's a single wall, and there's no record of it being upgraded since pre-1998, you have a massive problem.
A huge red flag.
A red flag the size of a billboard. It means that tank is illegal. It has been operating illegally for decades, and it's almost certainly leaking. The cleanup costs could easily exceed the value of the entire property.
And again, going back to that marriage concept, a leaking tank isn't just an EPA fine.
No way. It's a fire hazard. It's an explosion hazard. Vapors from that leak can migrate through the soil and end up in basements, in utility vaults, or sewer lines.
And if they find an ignition source.
Boom! A leaky gas tank is a perfect example of where environmental compliance and safety risk management are the exact same thing. You can't separate them.
Okay, let's shift gears. We've talked about waste. We talked about oil. Now let's talk about killing bugs.
FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act.
Now, I love the phrase that Yates emphasizes here. It's a mantra for anyone handling pesticides, and I think it should be tattooed on the arm of anyone working in groundskeeping or agriculture. The label is the law.
We say that all the time, but I really don't think people realize how literal it is. It is not a slogan. It is a legal doctrine.
Okay, so explain the difference between a pesticide label and, say, a paint can label.
Great comparison. When you buy a can of spray paint, the label has instructions. It's advice. Apply 2 coats, hold 10 inches away.
Right.
If you apply 1 coat and you hold it 2 inches away, you haven't broken the law. You just have a really bad, drippy paint job.
Right. No one is arresting me for bad painting.
Exactly. But with a pesticide regulated under FIFRA, that label is a legally binding document. It is a contract between you and the EPA. If the label says, wear long sleeves and chemical-resistant gloves, and you are out there spraying it in a T-shirt, you are violating federal law.
Wow.
If the label says, do not apply within 50 feet of water, and you are 40 feet away from a stream, you are breaking the law.
That is a huge distinction. It completely removes user discretion.
Completely. And this is because of the incredible rigor that goes into creating that label. Yates lists the data requirements under 40 CFR Part 158. It is extensive.
It's not just, does it kill the bug?
Oh, not at all. To get a pesticide registered, the manufacturer has to supply data on product chemistry, environmental fate, meaning where does this stuff go? Does it break down? Does it soak into the groundwater?
Residue chemistry.
Right. How much of it is left on the apple when I go to eat it? Hazards to humans, both dietary, from eating it, and non-dietary, from breathing it while spraying. Hazards to domestic animals. Hazards to non-target organisms like bees or fish.
So when you hold that bottle, you are holding the result of millions and millions of dollars of scientific testing.
And that's why the label is the law, because that label represents the safety envelope. The EPA has determined that within the instructions on that label, the risk is acceptable. The second you step outside those instructions, the risk is unacceptable and illegal.
And for the safety professional, FIFRA is huge because of the worker protection standard, the WPS. It's not just about the bug dying, it's about the person holding the sprayer not dying.
Precisely. FIFRA mandates that you protect the agricultural workers and the pesticide handlers. It dictates the PPE they have to wear. It dictates the re-entry interval, or REI, how long you have to wait before you can walk back into that field after it's been sprayed.
And if the label says 24 hours and you send a worker in at 23 hours?
That is an OSHA violation and a FIFRA violation. It's a pure safety function that is driven entirely by an environmental law.
All right, let's take a deep breath, literally, because we need to talk about the air we breathe. The Clean Air Act, or CAA.
This is probably the most complex piece of legislation we will touch on today. If RCRA is a beast, the Clean Air Act is a hydra. It is dense.
And Yates jokes about the alphabet soup in this section. There is one acronym that I think rules them all in the Clean Air Act, NAAQS.
NAAQS.
National Ambient Air Quality Standards. This is the absolute foundation of the Clean Air Act. The EPA sets limits for specific pollutants in the outside air, the ambient air that we all breathe. And again, let's make that distinction for our safety listeners. OSHA regulates the air inside the plant. The EPA regulates the air outside.
Correct. But it's all the same air. The moment you vent your exhaust out the stack, OSHA stops caring and the EPA starts caring. NAQS sets standards for 6 of what they call criteria pollutants.
What are they?
Carbon monoxide, lead, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, particle pollution, or PM and sulfur dioxide.
And the goal is protecting public health and welfare. But what I found really interesting is what happens when a region fails to meet those standards. We get into this concept of non-attainment areas.
This is critical for site selection and for daily operations. The EPA looks at regions, usually counties or metro areas, and it measures the air quality. If the air is dirtier than the standard allows for one of those pollutants, that area is designated as being in non-attainment.
And it's not just pass-fail, is it? There's a scale.
No, it's a sliding scale of bad. Yates lists the classifications in the book: marginal, moderate, serious, severe, and extreme.
Extreme non-attainment. That sounds intense.
It is. If you are a safety or environmental manager at a factory in an extreme non-attainment area like parts of Los Angeles or the San Joaquin Valley in California, your life is very different than if you were in a marginal area or an attainment area.
How so? What's the difference?
The regulations are just so much tighter. The permitting is harder. You might be required to install extremely expensive pollution control technology, state-of-the-art stuff, just to keep operating. You might have to buy offsets where you literally have to pay someone else in the area to reduce their pollution so you can emit yours. It gets very, very expensive.
Because the entire region is under intense pressure from the EPA to clean up.
Exactly. And the mechanism for that cleanup is another fun acronym, the SIP, the State Implementation Plan.
Again, we see this federal-state interplay just like with RCRA.
Yes. The Clean Air Act says to the states, okay, your air is dirty, you figure out how to clean it up. The state then has to write a SIP-A plan and submit it to the EPA.
So the plan might say something like, we're going to require cleaner fuels, or we're going to inspect car emissions more strictly.
Precisely. And if the EPA approves that plan, the state runs with it.
But what if the state fails? What if they don't submit a plan or their plan is just garbage?
Then the EPA steps in and imposes a FIP, a Federal Implementation Plan. And states hate that because the federal government comes in and tells local industries exactly what they have to do. Nobody wants a FIP. So states work very hard to get their SIPs approved, which means they push hard on the industries within their borders to comply.
Now, if I'm running a plant, how does all this actually hit my desk? It comes down to a permit.
Title V, the Title V operating permit. Yates compares this to a driver's license for pollution.
I like that analogy.
It fits perfectly.
Yeah.
You cannot legally operate a major source of air pollution without this permit.
Yeah.
And this permit is a monster document. It consolidates every single applicable requirement for your facility into one place. Emission limits, monitoring requirements, record keeping, reporting, everything.
And this is something the safety environmental manager needs to have essentially memorized.
It should be on your desk, dog-eared and highlighted. Because if you violate a condition in your Title V permit, say you run a generator for too many hours, or you forget to log a pressure drop on a scrubber, you are effectively operating without a license. That opens you up to massive daily fines and even citizen lawsuits.
It's incredibly high stakes.
Very high stakes.
Before we leave the Clean Air Act, we have to touch on Title VI. This deals with ozone. But I think there's a confusion point here that's worth clearing up. We talked about ozone in NABQS as a pollutant, something that burns your lungs. But here we are talking about stratospheric ozone protection.
Yes, and that is a fantastic point to clarify. It's the classic good ozone versus bad ozone story.
Okay.
Ground level ozone, which we discussed in NABQS, is the main component of smog. It's created by chemical reactions between pollutants and sunlight. It's bad. We want to reduce it.
Right. Bad nearby.
Bad nearby, exactly. Stratospheric ozone, which is miles and miles above our heads, is the ozone layer. It protects us from the sun's harmful ultraviolet radiation. It's good up high. We want to protect it.
So Title VI is all about phasing out the chemicals that destroy that good ozone layer.
Exactly. This is where you get the regulations on CFCs and HCFCs, the refrigerants used in air conditioners and chillers. Safety pros need to know this because handling these refrigerants requires special certification and specialized recovery equipment. You can't just vent Freon into the air anymore like they used to. That's a Title VI violation.
Okay, we have covered a lot of ground. I mean, we've done waste, oil, tanks, pesticides, air, and ozone. It is a lot of information.
It is. It's what we call a target-rich environment for the exams.
And that leads us perfectly to the so what. Why should our listener, the learner, care about all this? And I have to say, thanks to QHSE Talks for encouraging us to dig so deep into this chapter because the exam implications are just huge.
Let's synthesize this. First, for the exam candidate, the person prepping for the ASP or the CSP, we actually looked at the exam blueprint provided in the source material.
Yeah, let's look at those numbers. They're pretty stark.
For the ASP, the Associate Safety Professional Exam Domain 5 is environmental management. It makes up 15% of the exam.
15%, that's huge.
It is massive. If you blow off the environmental section because you think, I'm a safety guy, I don't do enviro, you are starting with a maximum possible score of 85. You are severely handicapping yourself. You cannot pass without this knowledge.
And for the CSP, the Certified Safety Professional, it's a bit lower.
Domain 7 coming in at around 7.38%. A bit lower, yes, but still very significant. And frankly, the questions can be much trickier at the CSP level.
So purely from a I want to pass the test perspective, Chapter 34 is high yield.
Extremely high yield. It tests your ability to navigate the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, outside of just the OSHA standards. They want to know that you can look up a rule in 40 CFR for environment just as easily as you can in 29 CFR for labor.
But beyond the exam, let's talk about the actual job. We talked about this marriage of safety and environment.
Right. Compliance versus risk. That's the dynamic you're always playing with. Environmental management is often driven by very rigid compliance. You must report this if it exceeds 25 gallons. You must have this permit. It's very binary. You either did it or you didn't.
Whereas safety is often more risk-based. How do we reduce the likelihood of this injury? How do we lower the severity?
Right. But the intersection is where the modern professional lives. A failure in environmental management almost always creates an immediate safety hazard. We mentioned the leaking UST, that's a fire and explosion risk.
Right.
Improper waste storage, that's a chemical reaction or an exposure risk for your warehouse guy who has to move those drums.
So if you were ignoring the E in HSE, you aren't just risking an EPA fine down the road. You are missing a huge chunk of the immediate safety picture.
You are. You are managing with one eye closed. If you don't know what kind of hazardous waste is sitting on your loading dock, how can you possibly write a proper emergency response plan for the fire department?
That's a great point. The fire department needs to know if that drum is RCRA hazardous waste or if it's just soapy water.
Exactly. It changes their entire response.
As we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought on this. Yates frames this whole chapter in a way that really stuck with me. He suggests that environmental management is really just long-term safety.
I love that framing. It's so true. Safety is often about the acute hazards, the fall, the cut, the electrocution. It happens now.
The immediate consequence.
Right. Environmental hazards are often chronic. The carcinogen in the water, the particulate in the air. It might not hurt you today, but it will hurt you or your community or your children tomorrow.
It's protecting people from hazards that play the long game.
And that is a really noble and essential part of the profession.
So here's the provocation for you, the listener, the expert challenge for the week.
I want you to go to your facility tomorrow or look at your client's facility. Find the waste manifest, find the air permit. If you looked at those documents right now, would you know if you personally or your company are liable for a violation?
Oof.
Do you actually know where your waste is going? Do you know if your tanks are 1998 compliant?
That's a scary question for a lot of people, I think.
It should be, but the answer is in the paperwork. Don't assume the waste hauler is handling it. Don't assume the maintenance guy from 20 years ago checked the tank. Verify. Because in the eyes of the law, RCRA, FIFRA, CAA ignorance is not a defense.
The E in HSE isn't just an add-on, it's a foundation of the job.
Absolutely.
That is it for this deep dive into Chapter 34 of the Yates text. A big thank you to QHSE Talks for providing the platform for this discussion. We hope we made the alphabet soup a little more digestible for you.
And remember, the label is the law.
The label is the law. Thanks for listening and stay safe inside and outside the fence.